In the summer of 1990, a Belgian midfielder named Jean-Marc Bosman wanted to change clubs. His contract had expired. Another team wanted to employ him. Bosman wanted to accept this offer, but his existing club could still demand money before allowing him to leave. The proposed move collapsed, Bosman was suspended, and his professional career began to disintegrate. He responded by taking the club, the Belgian football authorities, and UEFA to court. 5 years later, judges delivered a ruling that transformed football. Players approaching the end of their contracts gained unprecedented control over their careers. Nationality restrictions within European club football were overturned. Clubs changed the way they negotiated contracts, transfer fees, and wages. And the phrase leaving on a Bosman entered football's vocabulary. But what did Jean-Marc Bosman actually challenge? Did the ruling really create the modern transfer market? And did the man who changed football benefit from the revolution carrying his name? Welcome to the Football Brief, from the Nelson Brief, where we explain the context behind the game. This is the story of the Bosman ruling. To understand the case, we must first understand how football transfers once worked. Today, supporters generally accept that when a player reaches the end of a contract, that player can leave. The former club may offer a new deal, but it cannot normally demand an ordinary transfer fee simply because the player chooses to work elsewhere. Before the Bosman ruling, the position was very different. A player's employment contract could expire, but the club could continue controlling the player's football registration. A new club might still have to pay compensation before that player could be registered to play. The player was therefore out of contract, but not necessarily free. Imagine completing a fixed term job with one employer, receiving an offer from another company, and then being told that the second company must pay your former employer before it can employ you. That was broadly the problem Borsman faced. Football argued that the system protected clubs that had trained and developed players. It also provided income for smaller clubs and prevented wealthy teams from recruiting every available footballer. But for players, the system could restrict where they worked even after the employment agreement had ended. Their old club could demand a fee which no new club was willing to pay. The player might then have no contract, no transfer, and no realistic way to continue a career. Jean-Marc Bosman was not one of Europe's biggest football stars. He was a Belgian professional who had represented his country at youth level and played for clubs including Standard Liège and RC Liège. In 1988, he joined RC Liège, then a Belgian First Division club. His contract ran until the 30th of June 1990 and provided an average monthly salary of 120,000 Belgian francs, including bonuses. As the contract approached its end, Liège offered Bosman a new 1 year deal, but the proposed wage was only 30,000 Belgian francs per month, the minimum permitted under the Belgian Federation's rules. It represented an enormous pay reduction. Bosman rejected the offer. Liège then placed him on the transfer list and calculated compensation of 11,743,000 Belgian francs. No club agreed to pay it. Bosman eventually reached a proposed agreement with Dunkerque, a club in the French second division. The French club offered him approximately 100,000 Belgian francs per month and a signing on payment. A temporary transfer was arranged, with Dunkirk due to pay Liège 1.2 million Belgian francs. Dunkirk would also receive an option to complete a permanent transfer for 4.8 million, but Liège had doubts about Dunkirk's ability to pay. The Belgian club did not request the transfer certificate needed to complete the move. The transfer collapsed. Bosman was then suspended, preventing him from playing for the entire season. Bosman could have accepted the situation. He could have signed Liège's reduced contract, abandoned the move to France, or attempted to find another club willing to pay the compensation. Instead, he went to court. On the 8th of August 1990, Bosman began legal proceedings against RC Liège and the Belgian football authorities. His argument was ultimately based upon a fundamental European principle. The Treaty of Rome protected the freedom of workers from one member state to accept employment in another. Bosman was a Belgian citizen who wanted to work for a French employer, but football's transfer rules prevented him from taking that employment unless the two clubs reached a financial agreement. He argued that this was an obstacle to his freedom of movement as a European worker. The legal battle expanded beyond Bosman's failed move. He also challenged UEFA's restrictions upon the number of foreign European players who could appear for a club. The case moved through the Belgian courts before questions were referred to the European Court of Justice. The issue was no longer simply whether RC Liège had treated one player unfairly. The court was being asked whether some of the foundations of European football were incompatible with European law. The second part of Bosman's challenge concerned nationality restrictions. European clubs were not free to field unlimited numbers of players from other European countries. By 1991, UEFA operated what became known as the 3 plus 2 rule. National associations could restrict clubs to fielding 3 foreign players plus 2 additional foreign players who had spent at least 5 uninterrupted years in that country, including 3 years as a junior. The same type of restriction applied in UEFA club competitions. This meant a Belgian, Dutch, French, or German player could legally work in another member state, but football regulations might still prevent the new club from fielding that player. The restrictions were intended partly to preserve the national character of club teams and encourage the development of local players. However, Bosman argued that they discriminated against workers because of their nationality. A club in France could field as many French players as it wanted, but players from Belgium, Germany, or the Netherlands could count against the foreign player quota, even though all were citizens of the European community. The court therefore had to decide whether football was sufficiently different from other industries to justify restricting European workers in this way. Football's governing bodies argued that sport had special characteristics. Clubs needed competitive balance, smaller teams needed compensation for developing players, national leagues needed a connection with their home countries. Football could not be treated exactly like an ordinary commercial business. The court accepted part of that argument. It recognised that some sporting rules can be justified because they are necessary for the organisation of competitions. National teams, for example, can still require players to possess the nationality of the country they represent. Transfer deadlines can also be permitted because competitions require stable squads and orderly registration systems. But professional football is also an economic activity. Players are employees. Clubs pay wages, receive income, and compete for workers. The court concluded that football could not remove itself entirely from European employment law merely by describing its regulations as sporting rules. Rules made by private organisations such as football associations could still restrict the workers' legal rights. Football was special, it was not above the law. On the 15th of December 1995, the European Court of Justice delivered its judgment in case C 415/93. The court ruled that requiring a new club in another member state to pay a fee for an out of contract player restricted that player's freedom of movement. The transfer system directly affected the player's access to employment. A club might want to employ the player, and the player might want to accept, but the move could still be blocked by a financial dispute between the two clubs. The court rejected the argument that the system was justified by the need to reimburse clubs for earlier transfer costs. It also ruled against the nationality quotas, restrictions preventing clubs from fielding more than a limited number of players from other member states amounted to discrimination based upon nationality. The judgment therefore produced two major results. An eligible player could move to a club in another EU member state after the contract expired without the new club paying an ordinary transfer fee to the former club. Clubs could no longer treat players from other EU countries as foreigners for the purpose of UEFA's nationality quota. A Belgian player working in France, an Italian playing in Spain, or a Dutch player joining an English club was exercising the same European employment rights as workers in other industries. The Bosman ruling is frequently misunderstood. It did not abolish transfer fees. A club could still demand a fee for a player who remained under contract. When Real Madrid, Manchester United, or Bayern Munich purchase a contracted player, they are still compensating the former club for agreeing to end that contract early and release the registration. Bosman concerned players whose contracts had expired. The judgment also initially concerned movement between EU member states. It was based upon European freedom of movement law, not a declaration that every footballer everywhere had an unlimited right to change clubs under any circumstances. The court did not abolish transfer windows. It did not prevent compensation systems designed specifically to reward clubs for training young players, provided those systems were proportionate and legally defensible. It did not stop national teams selecting players according to nationality, and it did not guarantee Bosman a successful football career. The judgment was revolutionary, but it was not a complete destruction of the transfer system. It altered the point at which a club's control over an adult player ended. Once the agreed contract expired, the former club could no longer use an ordinary transfer fee to prevent a qualifying European player accepting employment in another member state. The immediate effect was to strengthen the bargaining position of players approaching the end of their contracts. Previously, the former club could still expect compensation after the contract expired. After Bosman, a player entering the final year of a deal represented a serious financial risk. The club faced several options. It could offer a new contract, it could sell the player before the contract ended, or it could risk losing the player without receiving an ordinary transfer fee. The player gained leverage. A desirable free agent could negotiate with clubs that did not need to spend millions on a transfer fee. Some of the money that might once have gone to the selling club could instead appear in the player's wages, signing on payment, or agent's commission. A transfer described as free could therefore remain extremely expensive. The new club might pay no ordinary fee to the former club, but could offer the player a larger salary and a substantial signing on bonus. Players and representatives also became more conscious of contract timing. Reaching the final 6 months could create an opportunity to negotiate a future agreement subject to the application regulations. The contract was no longer simply a promise to employ a player, it became an asset whose value declined as the expiry date approached. Clubs adapted quickly. Important players were offered longer contracts. Negotiations over renewals began earlier. Clubs became increasingly reluctant to allow valuable players to enter the final year of a deal without a decision. A player refusing to renew could be sold before becoming a free agent. Alternatively, the player could remain for the final season and leave without a conventional fee. Neither option was automatically wrong. A club might decide that one final season from an important player was worth more than the transfer fee available. A player might decide that completing the contract could produce more choice and a stronger financial package the following summer. But the balance had changed. The club could control the contracted player. It could no longer assume that control would continue after the contract expired. Football became increasingly focused upon the remaining length of each agreement. A talented player with 4 years remaining could command an enormous fee. The same player with 6 months remaining might be available for a fraction of that amount. The player had not suddenly become less talented. The difference was the value of the contract. Supporters of the old system warned that removing post contract transfer fees would harm smaller clubs. A club could spend years identifying, coaching, and developing a young player. When that player became successful, a wealthier club could wait for the contract to expire and recruit him without paying an ordinary transfer fee. Ajax became one of the most frequently cited examples. Its celebrated 1995 European champions were developed through an outstanding footballing system, but the team was gradually broken apart as players moved into wealthier leagues. UEFA later observed that Ajax's great side disintegrated for far less value than it might have generated before Bosman. The ruling did not create the financial inequality between European leagues. Television revenue, commercial growth, wealthy ownership, and the expansion of the Champions League all played major roles. But Bosman made it easier for players to move across European borders and made contract expiry far more dangerous for development clubs. Football authorities consequently searched for alternative methods of protecting clubs that trained young players. In 2001, FIFA and UEFA reached agreement with European political authorities on a revised international transfer system intended to provide greater contractual stability and protection for training clubs. Modern training compensation and solidarity systems attempt to direct money towards clubs involved in a player's development. They are not ordinary transfer fees charged simply because an adult player's employment contract has expired. Bosman also transformed the composition of European club teams. The judgment ended nationality quotas that discriminated between citizens of the EU member states in ordinary club competitions. An English club could no longer be told that French, Dutch, or Italian players counted against a limited foreign player allocation simply because they were not British. European clubs gained access to a much larger employment market. Players gained far more opportunities to work abroad. The effect could be seen in domestic leagues and European competition, where increasingly international squads became normal. This did not mean clubs were prevented from encouraging locally developed players. Modern homegrown player rules are generally framed around where a player was trained rather than the nationality written on a passport. A French citizen trained for several years at an English academy may satisfy an English homegrown requirement. An English citizen developed entirely overseas might not. This distinction is important. A nationality quota says a club must employ or field people from a particular country. A training rule focuses upon whether clubs are producing and developing players through their own football system. European law permits some proportionate sporting restrictions, but direct discrimination between EU workers because of nationality was the central problem Bosman exposed. The Bosman ruling is sometimes blamed for almost every unpopular development in modern football: rising wages, powerful agents, player mobility, declining loyalty, the concentration of talent among wealthy clubs. There is some truth behind the criticism. Bosman shifted power away from clubs and towards players, particularly those talented enough to attract several employers. Wealthier clubs could recruit experienced free agents without paying conventional transfer fees. Successful players could demand higher wages, signing on payments, and greater control over their destinations. But Bosman was not acting alone. The judgment arrived during a period of enormous commercial transformation. The Premier League had been created in 1992. Satellite television was pouring new money into football. The Champions League was expanding, sponsorship, global broadcasting, and commercial income were increasing. Clubs had more money to spend, while Bosman changed how that money could be divided. Without the ruling, more of it might have remained within club to club transfer fees. After the ruling, a greater share could flow towards players, representatives, and contractual bonuses. Bosman did not invent football's wealth. It helped change who possessed the bargaining power to claim it. The greatest irony is that Jean-Marc Bosman did not enjoy the type of career his ruling made possible for later players. His proposed move to Dunkirk collapsed. The legal dispute continued for years. He played for Saint Quentin in the French second division, later moved to Saint Denis de la Réunion, and eventually joined Olympique Charleroi in Belgium's lower divisions. The Belgian court found strong circumstantial evidence suggesting that European clubs had effectively avoided signing him despite his legal free status. By the time the European Court delivered its judgment in December 1995, Bosman was 31, and his career at a meaningful professional level had largely disappeared. He had defeated some of football's most powerful institutions, but he did not emerge as a wealthy superstar. He later spoke publicly about financial and personal difficulties and the damage the legal struggle had caused to his life. Meanwhile, generations of players benefited from the employment freedom created by the case carrying his name. Footballers could negotiate lucrative free transfers. Agents could secure signing on payments and larger salaries. Clubs could recruit players from across Europe, but the man at the centre of the revolution remained largely outside the prosperous football industry he had helped to create. The Bosman ruling changed football because it forced the sport to recognise a simple principle. A professional footballer is not merely an asset listed on a club's balance sheet. The player is also a worker. Clubs were entitled to enforce valid contracts. They were entitled to receive transfer fees when another club wanted to remove a player from an existing agreement. But when that agreement ended, the former club could not continue controlling the player's access to employment in another European country through an ordinary transfer fee. The ruling also established that European football could not discriminate between European workers through nationality quotas in club competition. Its consequences were enormous. Players gained mobility and negotiating power. Clubs became more careful about contract expiry. Agents became more influential. Free agents commanded larger wages and signing on payments. Smaller clubs became increasingly anxious about losing talent without receiving a major fee, and European squads became more international. Was every consequence positive? No. The ruling contributed to an economic system in which the richest clubs could attract leading players from a much wider market. It also weakened some of the security previously enjoyed by clubs that developed talent. But the old system carried a fundamental injustice. A player could complete the agreed contract and still be prevented from accepting another job because the former employer demanded money. Jean-Marc Bosman challenged that system. He lost much of his career during the struggle, but he established employment rights that transformed the careers of thousands who followed him. The most influential footballer of the modern era may not have won the World Cup, lifted the European Cup, or collected the Ballon d'Or. He may have been an ordinary Belgian midfielder who refused to accept that his club should control him after his contract had ended. This has been the Football Brief from the Nelson Brief, giving you the context behind the game. Did the Bosman ruling make football fairer, or did it give too much power to players, agents, and the richest clubs? Let me know in the comments and subscribe for more videos covering football, history, politics, and current affairs.